Master Sterling sold a mother's only son to pay a gambling debt, then demanded she sew him a new coat for the governor's ball. Sarah spent 3 days lining that coat with hundreds of rusted, serrated fish hooks hidden beneath the silk. The master thought he was dressing for a wedding, but he was actually stepping into a trap made of steel and thread. Sterling is about to find out that every step he takes toward power will tear his skin to ribbons. By the time the music stops, the blood on his white shirt will reveal a secret much darker than a simple debt. The air in South Carolina doesn't just sit on you, it weighs you down like a wet wool blanket. In the summer of 1852, the humidity was so thick you could taste the salt from the marshes miles away. On the Magnolia estate, the silence was louder than the cicadas. It was the kind of silence that grows when hope has been choked out of a place. Master Sterling sat on his porch, sipping lukewarm whiskey and watching the sunset. But he wasn't looking at the beauty of the land. He was looking at the numbers in his ledger, and those numbers were screaming. Sterling was a man who lived on the ghost of a reputation. To the neighbors and the governor, he was the heir to a grand legacy. To the people working his fields, he was a hollow shell of a man who would sell his own shadow if a creditor knocked on the door. He was bankrupt, deeply, dangerously bankrupt. His horses were fast, but his luck was slow. And a week ago, he had lost a bet that he couldn't cover with cash, so he paid with something else. He paid with Sarah's son. Sarah was 45 years old, but her hands looked 60. They were calloused, scarred by thousands of needle pricks, and steady as a surgeon's. She was the master seamstress of the estate. She knew the drape of every fabric and the curve of every shoulder. She knew how a man moved, and she knew exactly where a garment could bind or breathe. When Sterling came to her and told her that her son Caleb had drowned in the river while fishing, she didn't scream. She didn't drop the shears. She looked at his boots. They were dry. There was no mud from the riverbank. There was only the smell of expensive tobacco and the stench of a lie. Take a look at this. Some people call this tradition, but it's just cruelty with a name and a title. Sarah knew Caleb hadn't drowned. She had seen the slave trader's wagon leaving the back trail at dawn. She had seen the way Sterling couldn't meet her eyes for a full 3 seconds. But in that house, a word against the master was a rope around the neck, so she stayed quiet. She went back to her small room behind the kitchen, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She didn't cry, because tears make your eyes blurry, and she needed to see clearly for what was coming next. 2 days later, Sterling walked into her workspace. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't mention the boy again. He threw a bolt of heavy navy blue wool onto her table. It was the finest fabric money could still buy, or rather, the finest fabric credit could steal. He told her the governor was hosting a ball in 10 days. Sterling was going to ask for the hand of the governor's daughter, Charlotte. It was his last play. If he married into that family, his debts would vanish, and his crimes would be buried under a mountain of political influence. "I want a coat, Sarah," he said, his voice raspy from the whiskey. "The best you've ever made. A Sunday coat that makes me look like the master of this county. High collar, tight fit, silk lining, and I want it done by Friday." He didn't notice that Sarah's hands didn't shake. He didn't notice the way she gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. He just turned on his heel and left, leaving the scent of desperation in the room. Sarah stared at that navy blue wool. It was beautiful. It was the color of the deep ocean, the kind of blue that looked black in the shadows. She began to measure. She began to cut. But as she worked, she wasn't thinking about the governor's daughter. She was thinking about the way Sterling had sold her flesh and blood to cover a horse race. She was thinking about the empty bed in her cabin. The turning point came on the 3rd night. Sterling was out, likely trying to charm another lender or drinking away his nerves at the local tavern. Sarah was tasked with cleaning his private study, a job she usually did with Liza, her 12-year-old granddaughter. Liza was a bird like Pearl, quick and observant.
She was the one who noticed the loose floorboard under the heavy oak desk. "Grandma, look," Liza whispered, pointing to a sliver of paper peeking through the wood. Sarah moved the desk with a strength she didn't know she had. She pried up the board. Inside wasn't gold or jewelry, it was a tin box, and inside that box was the real history of the Magnolia estate. There was a document, yellowed and stained with something dark, something that looked like old blood. It was the original will of Sterling's father. Sarah couldn't read every word, but she knew enough. She saw the name of the true heir. It wasn't Sterling. It was a cousin who had supposedly died of fever years ago. The document in her hand was a legal deed, signed and witnessed, proving that Sterling had forged the papers that gave him the plantation. He wasn't just a gambler, he was a thief, and quite possibly a murderer. This paper was the only thing that could strip him of everything. It was his life, and it was his death. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at the navy blue coat hanging on the mannequin. A plan began to form, not in her head, but in her fingers. She didn't just want him to lose his land. She wanted him to feel every bit of the pain he had inflicted on her and her son. She wanted him to bleed. She sent Liza to the old fishing shack by the creek. "Bring me the hooks," Sarah told her. "The small ones, the ones with the barbs that catch in the throat of the catfish. Bring me all of them." Liza didn't ask why. She saw the look in Sarah's eyes. It was the look of a woman who had finished mourning and started counting. When the hooks arrived, Sarah went to work in the dead of night. She began to prepare the lining of the coat. She didn't just sew the hooks in, she engineered them. She placed them in the armpits, where the skin is thin and the movement is constant. She placed them along the inner collar, so every time he turned his head to smile at the governor, a dozen steel points would graze his jugular. She placed them in the small of the back and along the ribs, but she was careful. She was a master after all. She used a thin, stiff buckram to hold the hooks upright, pointing inward toward the body. Then she covered them with the finest, most delicate silk. To the touch, the coat felt plush and expensive, but as soon as a man put his weight into it, as soon as his body heat softened the silk and his movements pushed the fabric against his skin, the hooks would find their mark. And in the right shoulder, right where the heavy padding met the seam, she sewed the stolen deed. She wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth to keep the blood from soaking through too quickly, but she positioned it so the only way to get it out would be to rip the coat apart. By Thursday morning, the coat was finished. It sat on the mannequin, looking regal and sharp. It was a masterpiece of deception. Master Sterling came in to inspect it. He ran his hand over the sleeve. He felt the weight of the wool. He didn't feel the hundreds of tiny rusted barbs waiting beneath the surface. "Good work, Sarah," he muttered. He didn't look at her. He was looking at his own reflection in the tall mirror, imagining himself standing next to the governor. "This coat will change everything." Sarah stood in the shadows, her hands hidden in her apron. "I believe it will, master. It's a coat made exactly for a man like you." He laughed, a dry, arrogant sound. He didn't hear the edge in her voice. He didn't see the way Liza was watching him from the doorway, her eyes wide and knowing. Eyes wide with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Sterling reached out to take the coat, but Sarah stepped forward. "Let me press it one last time, master," she said. "The collar needs to be stiff for the governor." Sterling nodded and walked out, already dreaming of his new life. But as soon as the door closed, Sarah picked up the needle again. She wasn't done. She had one more loop to close. She took a length of heavy-duty upholstery thread, thread that wouldn't snap, thread that could hold a sail in a storm. She reinforced the buttonholes. She made sure that once those buttons went through, they weren't coming out without a fight. She made the coat a cage. The sun began to set on the day before the ball. The carriage was being cleaned, the horses were being groomed, and in the quiet of the sewing room, Sarah sat alone. She thought about Caleb. She wondered where he was, if he was cold, if he was being treated like a beast. She looked at her bloody thumb, pierced by one of the hooks as she set the final stitch. She didn't wipe the blood away.
She smeared it on the inside of the collar, hidden by the dark blue wool. Master Sterling was a man who thought he could outrun his past. He thought he could sell a boy and buy a future. But he was about to learn that some debts aren't paid in gold. Some debts are paid in inches of skin and drops of blood. And the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has nothing left to lose but their silence. The stage was set, the coat was ready, and as the moon rose over the South Carolina pines, the countdown to the governor's ball began. Sterling didn't know it yet, but he wasn't dressing for a party. He was dressing for his own execution. Master Sterling stood before the tall mahogany mirror, admiring the silhouette of a man who didn't exist. He saw a powerful landowner, a future son-in-law to the governor, and a man of undisputed status. He didn't see the mountain of debt or the forged signatures that held his world together. Sarah stood 3 paces behind him, her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the way the heavy navy blue wool draped over his shoulders. She had spent the last 12 hours working in the flickering light of a single candle, her fingers bleeding from the very steel she was hiding inside the lining. The coat looked perfect. It was a masterpiece of tailoring, sharp at the shoulders and narrow at the waist. But beneath that expensive surface, hundreds of rusted fishhooks were waiting. Every time Sterling breathed, he was inches away from the barbs. Every time he shifted his weight, the silk lining shifted with him, bringing the steel teeth closer to his skin. He didn't know that he was putting on a suit of armor designed to kill him from the inside out. He thought he was dressing for a wedding, but he was actually stepping into a trap made of steel and thread. The tension in the room was so thick you could smell the copper of Sarah's blood and the sour sweat of Sterling's anxiety. He adjusted the high collar, and for a split second, a single hook grazed the back of his neck. He winced, reaching up to scratch the spot. "The starch is too heavy, Sarah," he barked, his voice sharp and impatient. "It's scratching like a damn briar patch. Fix it." Sarah didn't look up. She didn't blink. "It's new wool, master," she said, her voice a flat, dead calm. "It needs the heat of your body to soften. Once you're in the carriage, the fabric will settle. It's the price of a coat that fits like a second skin." Sterling grunted, satisfied by her submission. But what nobody knew was that the starch, he felt, was just the first of 300 barbs. Sarah had mapped his body like a butcher. She knew that when a man sits, the fabric across his shoulder blades tightens. She knew that when he raises a glass to toast, the armpits of the coat compress. And she knew that when he dances, the entire garment twists against the torso. She had placed the hooks in every high-pressure zone. Just as Sterling was about to call for his boots, there was a heavy knock at the front door. Not a polite knock, but the rhythmic, authoritative pounding of a man who wasn't going away. Sarah saw Sterling's face go pale. His hand went instinctively to his pocket, where he kept the key to the tin box she had raided the night before. He didn't know the box was empty. He didn't know the proof of his life's work, the forged deed, was currently sewn into the right shoulder of the very coat he was wearing. It was Sheriff Miller. He didn't wait to be invited in. He walked into the parlor, his spurs clicking against the hardwood like a clock counting down. Miller was a man who respected money, but he was starting to realize that Sterling didn't have any left. Behind him were 2 men in dark suits, creditors from the city. They weren't there to talk, they were there to inventory the furniture. "The governor's ball is tonight, Sterling," Miller said, eyeing the navy blue coat. "You look like a man who's about to marry a fortune, but these gentlemen here tell me your signatures on the banknotes don't match the ones on your father's old land grants. They're saying you've been playing a very dangerous game with other people's money." Sterling straightened his back, a move that caused 50 hooks to sink a fraction of an inch into his ribs. He didn't scream, but his eyes flared with a sudden sharp pain. He thought it was just the stress. He thought it was his nerves catching up to him. "The original deeds are in my safe," Sterling lied, his voice tight and impatient. "I'll produce them tomorrow after the engagement is official. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a future to secure." The creditors looked at each other. They didn't believe him, but they couldn't arrest a man on his way to the governor's house without proof. Not yet. But the clock was ticking. Sterling had exactly 4 hours to get that marriage contract signed before the sheriff came back with a search warrant. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe and tell me, was this proof, the stolen deed, a warning, or a sentence? The moment the sheriff left, Sterling turned his rage on Sarah. He grabbed her by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the very spot where she had hidden the rusted hooks. He didn't feel them through the heavy wool, but Sarah felt the weight of his hand. She felt the heat of his anger. "If that coat fails me tonight, Sarah," he hissed, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and rot, "I'll sell that granddaughter of yours to the same traitor who took Caleb. I'll clear this house for every living soul before the bank takes the walls. Do you understand me?" Sarah looked him in the eye for the first time. She didn't see a master. She saw a cornered animal. "The coat will not fail, master," she said. "It will do exactly what it was designed to do. It will show everyone exactly who you are." He shoved her aside and stomped toward the carriage. Every step he took was a gamble. The hooks in the seat of the coat and the back of the thighs began to engage. As he climbed into the carriage, the movement was too much. A dozen serrated barbs tore through the silk lining and found the soft flesh of his lower back. Sterling let out a sharp gasp, clutching the side of the carriage door. "Damned insects!" he muttered, reaching behind him to swat at what he thought was a biting fly. But there was nothing there, just the smooth, cold wool of his Sunday coat. He sat down heavily on the cushioned seat, and the weight of his own body drove the hooks in deeper. The carriage ride to the governor's mansion was 5 miles of dirt road and deep ruts. Every bump in the path was a new layer of agony. In the dark of the carriage, Sterling began to sweat. It wasn't just the heat of the South Carolina night, it was the sensation of 1,000 tiny needles slowly migrating into his muscles. He tried to lean forward to take the pressure off his back, but that only caused the hooks in his chest and stomach to bite. He was pinned. If he moved left, he was stung. If he moved right, he was bitten. He began to feel a strange, warm dampness spreading across his shoulder blades. He reached back and touched his shirt through the opening of the coat. His fingers came away sticky. He looked at his hand in the dim light of the carriage lamp. It was red. Blood. "Sarah," he whispered to the empty carriage, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and terror. He thought she had left a needle in the seam. 1 needle, maybe 2. He didn't realize he was wearing a whole tackle box. He tried to reach for the buttons, to take the coat off, to see the damage, but the upholstery thread Sarah had used was like iron. The buttons were jammed tight against the stiffened fabric. The more he struggled with the buttons, the more the hooks in his armpits dug in. He was trapped in a garment that was literally eating him alive. And then he remembered the sheriff's words, the signatures, the deeds. He reached for the inner pocket where he thought he had placed his forged papers, but his hand hit something hard and crinkly in the shoulder padding. He felt the shape of it. It was paper, but it wasn't the paper he had put there. Outside, the carriage slowed. He could hear the music from the ballroom, a violin playing a light, airy waltz. He could see the torches lining the governor's driveway. He was here. He was at the finish line. All he had to do was walk inside, smile, dance, and sign the contract. But as the door opened and the light flooded in, Sterling realized he couldn't stand up straight. His back was a map of fire. His shirt was becoming a sponge for his own blood, and the document hidden in his shoulder felt like a lead weight dragging him toward the floor. He saw the governor standing on the porch, flanked by his daughter and the local elite. They were all waiting for the bleeding gentleman. Sterling took a deep breath, a move that sent a fresh wave of hooks into his lungs. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace of death. He stepped out of the carriage, and with every step toward the house, the rusted barbs dragged through his skin like tiny sores. Sarah stood back at the estate, watching the carriage disappear into the trees. She held Lisa's hand, her own fingers finally still. She knew that by the time the first dance was over, the navy blue wool wouldn't be blue anymore. It would be purple. Subscribe.
Governor was a man who smelled of cedar and law, and he had a way of looking through a person rather than at them. "Sterling," the governor said, extending a hand. "You're late. My daughter has been asking for you, though I told her a man of your responsibilities has much to attend to before a night like this." Sterling reached out to take the governor's hand. It was a simple gesture, one he had done 1,000 times, but as his arm rose, the hooks in his armpit, the one Sarah had serrated with a whetstone, tugged at the delicate nerves under his skin. A cold flash of agony shot down to his fingertips. His hand shook just for a fraction of a second before he gripped the governor's palm. He squeezed too hard, a reflex of pain that he tried to disguise as a firm, masculine greeting. "My apologies, Governor," Sterling said, his voice sounding thin and distant to his own ears. "The preparations for the estate's transition took longer than expected. I wanted to ensure everything was in order before we spoke of the future." The governor narrowed his eyes. He noticed the beads of sweat forming on Sterling's forehead, despite the evening breeze coming through the open terrace doors. He also noticed something else, a faint metallic smell. It was the scent of a blacksmith's shop or a fresh kill. It was the smell of iron. "Are you well, Sterling? You look as though you've seen a ghost, or perhaps the weight of your new responsibilities is heavier than you anticipated." Sterling forced a laugh. It sounded like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "Just a bit of a chill from the carriage ride, Governor. Nothing a glass of punch won't cure." But the punch wasn't going to cure what was happening under the navy blue wool. As he moved deeper into the room, the new obstacles began to pile up. The ballroom wasn't a place for standing still. It was a place of constant, fluid motion. People bumped into him. A young officer patted him on the back in a gesture of camaraderie, and Sterling nearly lost consciousness as 3 hooks were driven into his shoulder blade. He had to lean against a marble pillar, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The problem was the document. The forged deed he thought he had brought was gone, and in its place was a heavy, crinkly mass in the lining of his right shoulder. Every time he moved his arm, the edges of the hidden paper sliced into the raw wounds the hooks had already made. He realized then that Sarah hadn't just put hooks in the coat. She had built a mechanism of exposure. The paper was the key, and the blood was the ink. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe and tell me, was this proof, the stolen deed, a warning, or a sentence? Sterling's mind was racing. He needed to get to a private room. He needed to tear this garment off his back and see what was happening. But he was a prisoner of his own vanity. To remove the coat would be to admit something was wrong. It would reveal the blood that was already beginning to seep through his white linen shirt, turning the inner lining of the coat into a sticky, warm mess. He could feel the fluid trickling down his ribs. It felt like a slow, rhythmic crawl of insects. He looked across the room and saw Charlotte, the governor's daughter. She was beautiful, dressed in pale green silk, but to Sterling she represented only a lifeline. If he could just get her to sign the marriage contract, the creditors would be held at bay. He started toward her, but his legs felt heavy. The hooks in the seat of his trousers, the ones Sarah had hidden in the heavy seams, were dragging against his thighs. Every step was a calculated risk. "Master Sterling," Charlotte said, curtsying as he approached, "I began to think you had stayed home to count your cotton instead of joining us." "I would count every star in the sky before I missed a moment with you, Charlotte," Sterling lied. The effort of the compliment made his chest tighten, driving a row of barbs into his pectoral muscles. He felt a sudden sharp pop in his chest, a hook snagging on a thread of muscle. He didn't gasp, he didn't cry out, he simply tightened his jaw until his teeth ached. "Then you must prove it," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief that felt like a death sentence. "The orchestra is starting a waltz. It's my favorite. Surely the man who owns half the county can spare one dance." The waltz, the very word made Sterling's stomach turn. A waltz required rotation. It required the torso to twist while the arms stayed elevated. It was the exact set of motions Sarah had designed the coat to punish.
He looked at the governor, who was watching them with a sharp, expectant gaze. There was no escape. To refuse would be an insult. To dance would be a suicide. "It would be my honor," Sterling said, his voice a rasping whisper. He led her to the center of the floor. The violins began to play a soaring, elegant melody that felt like a mockery of the carnage happening beneath his clothes. He placed his hand on Charlotte's waist. He raised his right arm to hold hers. As his elbow rose to shoulder height, the oilcloth-wrapped deed in the lining shifted. It acted like a wedge, pushing the concentrated cluster of hooks directly into the joint of his shoulder. He felt the first tear, not the fabric, but his skin. The serrated barbs caught and held. As the music picked up speed, he began to turn. Every rotation was a grind of steel against bone. He could feel the hooks walking through his flesh, pulling and tearing with each beat of the music. The room began to spin, not from the dance, but from the mounting shock. Charlotte looked up at him, her smile fading. "Master Sterling, you're shaking, and your hand, it's so cold." "The excitement, Charlotte," he managed to choke out. "Simply the excitement." But the blood was no longer staying hidden. A small dark bloom was beginning to appear on the right shoulder of the navy blue wool. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a shadow or a spill of wine, but the governor wasn't a casual observer. He was a man trained to look for the tear in the fabric of a story. He stepped closer to the edge of the dance floor, his eyes fixed on Sterling's back. Sterling felt the turning point. It wasn't just the pain anymore. It was the realization that he was losing control of the narrative. He was no longer the master of the Magnolia estate. He was a man being dismantled in front of the very people he sought to impress. He saw Sarah's face in his mind, not the face of a submissive servant, but the face of the woman who had watched him lie about her son. He understood now that she knew. She had always known. The dance reached its crescendo. The violins shrieked in a high, sustained note. Sterling swung Charlotte around in a final dramatic flourish. The centrifugal force pulled the coat tight against his body. In that moment, 100 hooks engaged at once. It was a symphony of agony. He felt his vision go black at the edges. He felt the heavy upholstery thread on his buttons strain against his chest, refusing let the garment breathe. He came to a stop, gasping for air, his hand still clutched in Charlotte's. The room went silent as the music ended. People were staring. They weren't looking at his face. They were looking at the floor. A single drop of bright arterial red hit the polished white marble. Then another. "Master Sterling," the governor said, his voice booming through the silent hall, "I believe you are unwell. In fact, I believe you are bleeding. Sheriff Miller, perhaps you should help the gentleman out of his coat so we can see the extent of his injury." Sterling felt a surge of pure, cold terror. The sheriff moved forward. Sterling tried to back away, but his muscles seized. The hooks were locked into his flesh like anchors. He was no longer wearing the coat. The coat was wearing him. "No," Sterling croaked, reaching for the buttons with trembling fingers. "It's nothing. An old wound from the war." "You weren't in the war, Sterling," the sheriff said, his hand reaching for the lapel. The moment of truth was here. The transition from the bleeding gentleman to the exposed fraud was only a heartbeat away. Sterling looked at the door, but he knew he wouldn't make it 3 steps. The hooks in his legs had already found the nerves. He was pinned to the floor of the governor's ballroom, a man made of porcelain and lies, and the cracks were finally
starting to show. The governor's hand was heavy on his shoulder, and every second that passed felt like a year. The silence in the room was a living thing, pressing against the windows, drowning out the distant sound of the crickets. Sterling's breath was coming in short, wet rattles. He could feel the blood now, not just as a trickle, but as a heavy, warm weight soaking into the navy blue wool. The fabric, once his greatest pride, was now a cold, wet sponge of his own making. He tried to pull away, but his legs wouldn't obey. The hooks in his thighs had found the nerves, pinning him to the spot like a specimen in a collector's box. The governor didn't let go.
He leaned in closer, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. "You're trembling, Sterling," Vance whispered, though the words carried to the back of the room. "And you're staining my floor. I've seen men shot in the gut show more composure than you're showing right now. What is under that coat that you're so afraid to show us?" Sterling tried to speak, but his throat was dry as bone. He looked at Charlotte, but she had backed away, her face pale with a mixture of disgust and horror. She saw the dark spreading stain on his shoulder. She saw the way his right arm hung at a useless, jagged angle. Sheriff Mueller didn't wait for permission. He was a man of action, and he could smell the rot in the room. He stepped forward, his large, calloused hands reaching for the top button of the Sunday coat. Sterling let out a sound then, a low, guttural whimper that didn't sound human. It was the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage was shrinking. "Stay back," Sterling gasped, his eyes darting toward the door. "It's a skin condition, highly contagious. You mustn't touch it." But the lie was too thin even for him. The sheriff ignored him, his fingers gripping the first button. That was when the real nightmare began. Sarah had used upholstery thread, a cord designed to hold the weight of a heavy man, to reinforce those buttonholes. As the sheriff pulled, the buttons didn't pop, the fabric didn't give. Instead, the entire front of the coat tightened against Sterling's chest. A dozen hooks hidden in the lapels sank deep into his collarbone. Sterling screamed, a high, piercing sound that shattered the dignity of the ballroom. He collapsed to his knees, but the sheriff didn't stop. He thought Sterling was resisting. He yanked harder. The movement was violent. As the sheriff forced the buttons through the stubborn holes, the coat twisted. The hundreds of hooks in the back and under the arms began to drag. It wasn't just a prick anymore. It was a harvest. The serrated barbs Sarah had chosen specifically for their ability to catch and hold began to tear through the layers of skin and muscle. Sterling was no longer a man. He was a canvas of agony. The guests began to move back, a circle of silk and lace widening around the bleeding man on the floor. "Hold him," the governor barked. Two other men stepped forward, grabbing Sterling by the arms to keep him upright while the sheriff worked. Every time they touched him, they drove more steel into his body. Sterling's head fell back, his jaw unhinged in a silent scream. The sweat was pouring off him now, mixing with the blood, making the silk lining even more slippery. The hooks were walking now, shifting with every heave of his chest, carving deep, jagged channels into his ribs. Then the second, then the third. As the coat fell open, the sheriff recoiled. Sterling's white linen shirt was no longer white. It was a shredded crimson rag glued to his skin by the drying blood. But it wasn't the blood that caught everyone's attention. It was the coat itself. As it hung loose from his shoulders, the inner lining shifted, and the candlelight hit the hundreds of tiny, rusted steel points. They glistened like the teeth of a shark. "My God," someone whispered. "He's been wearing a torture device." But the sheriff was looking at the right shoulder. The padding had been torn during the struggle, and something white was sticking out from the navy wool. It wasn't cotton, it wasn't silk, it was paper. Miller reached in, his fingers brushing against the rusted barbs. As he fished out the oilcloth-wrapped bundle Sarah had hidden so carefully, he pulled it free, and as he did, the weight of the document caused the coat to slip further down Sterling's arms, dragging another row of hooks through his biceps. The sheriff handed the bundle to the governor. Vance unwrapped the oilcloth with slow, deliberate fingers. He pulled out the yellowed, blood-stained paper, the original will of Sterling's father. The room was so quiet you could hear the governor's breathing. He read the first page, then the second. His face went from confusion to a cold, hard rage that made even the sheriff step back. "This is the deed to the Magnolia estate, the original, and it says here that Sterling was never the heir. It says the entire property was left to his cousin, Thomas, who was reported dead of fever 10 years ago. But look at the date on this witness signature, Sheriff. It was signed 3 months after Thomas was supposedly buried." The governor looked down at Sterling, who was slumped on the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You didn't just forge the deed, Sterling. You murdered the man who owned the land, and then you hid the proof in a tin box under your desk. And now it seems your own seamstress has delivered the evidence to me in the most painful way possible. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe and tell me, was this proof, the stolen deed, a warning or a sentence?" The realization hit the room like a physical wave. Sterling wasn't just a bankrupt gambler. He was a cold-blooded killer who had built his house on a foundation of bone. The governor looked at the blood on the floor, then at the shredded coat. He looked at the sheriff. "Take him and find the woman who made this. I want to know how she found this paper." But Sarah was already gone. While the carriage was racing toward the governor's mansion, she had taken Liza and slipped into the woods. She didn't head for the north, not yet. She headed to the river, to the place where the traders kept their records. She had the tin box, and inside it was something else Sterling hadn't noticed, the name and location of the man who had bought Caleb. Sterling was dragged out of the ballroom, his feet trailing in his own blood. He didn't fight. He couldn't. The hooks were still in him, some of them broken off deep in his muscles, others still clinging to the navy wool. They didn't take the coat off him gently. They ripped it away, and with it they took the top layer of his skin. He was thrown into a cold, damp cell in the county jail, still shivering, still bleeding. The justice was swift, but it wasn't the law that finished him. Sarah had been careful to use rusted hooks, hooks that had sat in the damp fishing shack for years. Within 3 days, Sterling's fever began to rise. His back turned a sickly shade of purple, then black. The infection spread through his blood like a wildfire. He spent his final hours screaming, not for mercy, but from the sensation of 1,000 needles still pricking his skin, even though the coat was gone. He died in that cell, alone, stripped of his name, his land, and his life. The Magnolia estate was seized by the state. The governor, moved by the sheer audacity of the crime and the silent witness of the coat, didn't hunt Sarah down. He had the proof he needed to clear the books, and he quietly let the disappearance of the seamstress go uninvestigated. Sarah found Caleb 2 months later in a small town in Georgia. He was working a forge, his face covered in soot, but he was alive. She didn't have money, and she didn't have a name, but she had the truth, and in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. She had sewn a trap out of pride and steel, and she had watched the man who broke her heart bleed out in a room of his own kind. A man who builds his house on the pain of others shouldn't be surprised when that pain follows him home. Sterling died because he was too proud to admit his coat was killing him. He thought the navy blue wool made him a king, but it only made him a target. Sarah knew the anatomy of a coat, but more importantly, she knew the anatomy of a man's greed. And in the humid heat of South Carolina, she proved that a needle and a bit of rusted steel can be more powerful than a gavel or a gun. Some debts are paid in gold, but the oldest ones are always paid in blood.